But the gist of what we're talking about is the World Fair, this exhibition, this massive, massive event that brought together something like, I think, 54 countries across the world in a multi-million-dollar event. Millions upon millions of people went and viewed this thing. It was ridiculous. So many different inventors, inventions, like cultural artifacts, like everything occurred here.
In May 1893, 27 million Americans walked through the gates of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. They called it the White City. 690 acres, over 200 buildings, 65,000 exhibits, the largest gathering of architectural grandeur the Western Hemisphere had ever witnessed. The official story says they built it in 22 months. Think about that for a moment. 200 monumental structures, massive domed halls with ceilings that disappeared into shadow, colonnades stretching a quarter mile in perfect symmetry, towers rising 200 feet into the sky, crowned with statues that weighed tons, fountains that required their own power stations, electric lights numbering in the hundreds of thousands, all constructed from scratch on reclaimed swampland by workers using horse-drawn carts and hand tools. No modern cranes, no hydraulic lifts, no computer-aided design, no prefabricated components shipped from factories, just muscle, mortar, and an impossible deadline. Then, 18 months after the fair closed, almost everything burned to the ground, fire after fire after fire, until only 2 buildings remained standing. The official history calls this a triumph of American ingenuity followed by unfortunate destruction. But what if that history is wrong? What if they didn't build it? What if they found it? Let's examine what the official record actually claims. Not what we assume, what the documents themselves say. In 1890, the site selected for the World's Columbian Exposition was a swamp, literally. Jackson Park on Chicago's south side was marshland requiring massive drainage and landfill operations before a single foundation could be poured. Contemporary photographs show the area before construction began. Pools of standing water stretching to the horizon, reed grass taller than men, mud so deep it swallowed wagon wheels whole, the kind of terrain that swallowed equipment and drowned workers who stepped in the wrong place. The planning documents show the fair was originally scheduled for 1892. The 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, October 12th, 1892. That was the date. That was the promise made to the nation and the world. Congress had approved it. Foreign governments had committed to participate. The timeline was set. But the organizers quietly postponed to 1893, admitting in their own records that they realized the exposition could not possibly open on time. That admission should raise immediate questions. These were the most ambitious builders in America. Daniel Burnham had constructed some of Chicago's tallest structures. He knew deadlines, he knew logistics. He had built the Montauk Building, the Rookery, the Monadnock, landmarks that still stand today. Frederick Law Olmsted had designed Central Park. He understood landscape transformation at massive scale. He had turned Manhattan swampland into the most famous urban park on Earth. They assembled the finest architectural minds on the continent: John Root, Charles McKim, Richard Morris Hunt, George Post, names that still appear in architecture textbooks as masters of their craft. Men who had built monuments across America and Europe, and they couldn't meet a deadline they'd had 5 years to prepare for. The construction records tell a strange story. In 1891 alone, there were 700 documented accidents on the worksite, 18 deaths, workers crushed by falling materials, men who disappeared into foundation trenches that collapsed without warning, scaffolding failures, equipment malfunctions. The winter of 1892-93 was so severe that work became difficult and dangerous according to contemporary accounts. The ground froze solid for months, tools shattered in the cold. Progress slowed to a crawl. Yet somehow, despite the delays, despite the accidents, despite weather that made outdoor labor nearly impossible for months at a time, they delivered over 200 buildings, ready for opening day on May 1st, 1893. How? The official answer: staff construction. The buildings weren't stone or marble, they were iron frames covered in staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber that could be molded and applied quickly. The material had been invented in France. It was lightweight. It could be shaped into any decorative form. It dried fast. This explanation satisfies most historians. Temporary materials, prefabricated components, modern industrial efficiency applied to architectural spectacle. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the scale. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building alone covered 44 acres under a single roof. 44 acres. That's larger than most small towns. You could fit the Roman Colosseum inside it 4 times over. The clear-span steel arch supporting that roof stretched 368 feet, wider than any structure previously built in human history. The Galerie des Machines at the Paris Exposition of 1889 had held the previous record. The Chicago architects beat it deliberately, explicitly, as a matter of national pride. But the Paris structure had taken years to engineer. Teams of mathematicians calculating load tolerances, multiple prototype arches tested and refined, failures documented and studied, a paper trail showing every step of the engineering process. The Chicago span appeared suddenly, fully realized, with no documented learning curve, no failed attempts in the historical record, no progression from crude to refined, no engineering papers showing the development process, as if the knowledge arrived complete, as if someone already knew exactly how to achieve what no one had achieved before. I want you to look at the photographs, not at the buildings themselves, at the people standing in front of them. Look at the doorways, look at the windows, look at the staircases. The main entrance to the administration building featured doors 18 feet tall. The corridors inside stretched 12 feet from floor to ceiling, not in ceremonial spaces designed to impress visitors, but in working hallways where staff moved equipment and supplies, hallways that visitors never saw, hallways that served no aesthetic purpose whatsoever. The grand basin, surrounded by the principal buildings of the Court of Honor, featured steps with risers so tall that contemporary visitors complained of difficulty climbing them. Photographs show adults stretching their legs to mount each stair, women in long dresses struggling with heights that exceeded comfortable human stride, children being carried by parents who couldn't manage the climb themselves. Why would architects designing for a public exhibition, when expecting millions of visitors, including elderly guests and children, build staircases that made normal humans uncomfortable? The standard explanation: grandeur, intimidation. These buildings were meant to impress, to awe, to make visitors feel small, against the majesty of American industrial achievement. That explanation works for the ceremonial spaces, the grand entrances, the public halls where spectacle was the entire point. It doesn't work when you examine the proportions systematically. The electricity building featured interior doorways 15 feet high in sections designated for staff operations, areas no public visitor would ever see. The transportation building had loading bays scaled for vehicles that didn't exist in 1893. Wagons of the era stood 8 feet tall at maximum. These bays could have accommodated something twice that height. The ceiling clearances exceeded anything the transportation technology of the era required. The fisheries building contained tanks and walkways at heights that required ladders for maintenance workers to access comfortably, not scaffolding for construction, permanent access points built into the design, scaled for someone significantly taller than the workers documented on the payroll. These weren't aesthetic choices. These were functional specifications. Specifications that made no sense for human-scaled operations, unless the original specifications weren't designed for humans of average size. I started measuring doorways in photographs, not the grand ceremonial entrances. Those could be explained as architectural drama. The service doors, the staff passages, the back corridors where grandeur serves no purpose and efficiency is everything. 12 feet, 14 feet, consistently systematically oversized throughout the complex. Door after door after door, scaled for occupants we're told didn't exist. And here's what made me stop dismissing this as coincidence. The same proportional anomalies appear in government buildings from the same era across multiple continents: St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Delhi, Melbourne. Administrative structures featuring doorways and staircases scaled for occupants significantly larger than the documented populations they supposedly served. Buildings constructed thousands of miles apart by different architects for different governments and different cultures, all featuring the same inexplicable proportions, all built in the same narrow window of decades, all using similar construction techniques. What if these buildings weren't built simultaneously by architects sharing aesthetic preferences? What if they were built earlier by a population we've been taught didn't exist? Construction of this scale requires more than blueprints. It requires labor, skilled labor, massive quantities of it. The official payroll records for the World's Columbian Exposition documented approximately 14,000 workers at peak construction: carpenters, masons, ironworkers, laborers, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, skilled craftsmen and general hands working together under Burnham's direction. 14,000 workers, 22 months, over 200 buildings. Let's calculate what that actually means. If we divide 200 buildings among 14,000 workers over 22 months, each worker would need to complete the equivalent of constructing an entire building roughly every 5 months, while simultaneously working on shared infrastructure, landscaping, utilities, and finishing work, while coordinating with thousands of other workers, while managing supply chains that stretched across the continent. That's not construction, that's magic. Modern construction analysis suggests the labor requirements for a project of this scope, using 1890s technology, would have exceeded 50,000 full-time workers over a minimum of 4 years. Minimum. That estimate assumes optimal conditions: no accidents, no weather delays, no supply chain disruptions, no coordination failures. The Chicago Fair had all of these problems, constantly. Where were the other 36,000 workers? The financial records are equally strange. The fair's total expenses reached approximately $30 million. A significant sum for 1893, but remarkably efficient for what was allegedly constructed. By comparison, the Brooklyn Bridge, a single structure, impressive but nowhere near the scale of the White City, had cost $15 million and required 14 years to complete. 14 years for one bridge, 22 months for 200 buildings at twice the cost. The mathematics don't work. They've never worked. But no one asks because the buildings are gone, the records are incomplete, and questioning the official narrative invites ridicule. But the workforce anomalies extend beyond simple numbers. Photographs from the construction period show tools that don't match the documented labor force. Wrenches 4 and 5 feet long, hammers requiring two-handed grips from users with exceptional reach, scaffolding systems with step heights that would challenge modern workers equipped with safety harnesses and fall protection. Museums categorize these as industrial equipment without explaining what industrial process would require tools of such dimensions. Auction houses sell them as antique curiosities without asking why they were manufactured in quantities that keep surfacing in estate sales and building demolitions more than a century later. These aren't display pieces, they show wear patterns, grip erosion from actual use, metal fatigue consistent with repeated stress over extended periods, the kind of wear that only comes from tools used daily for years by workers who needed them, functional tools designed for hands much larger than ours, tools that appeared in the same decades as the buildings with the oversized doorways, tools that vanished from production around the same time the proportional anomalies stopped appearing in new construction. The White City opened on May 1st, 1893. President Grover Cleveland pressed a golden button. Electric lights blazed across 600 acres. Fountains erupted. The crowd surged forward so forcefully that women fainted in the crush. Jane Addams had her purse snatched in the chaos. The exposition was on. It closed on October 30th of the same year. 6 months. 27 million visitors, approximately 1 in 4 Americans, walked through its gates during that brief window. Then the destruction began. January 8th, 1894. Fire breaks out in the casino at the southeast corner of the Court of Honor. Flames spread along the peristyle, gut the music hall, leap across fire breaks to the manufacturer's building. The blaze damages the French and Belgian exhibits. A bronze vase by Gustave Doré, priceless, irreplaceable, is destroyed in the flames. February 1894. The colonnade between agriculture and machinery burns. Another fire, another section gone, another piece of evidence reduced to ash. July 5th, 1894. The rest of the Court of Honor goes up in smoke. Terminal station, machinery hall, administration, electricity, mining, manufacturers. One night, everything. The flames were visible for miles. Witnesses described it as apocalyptic. The sky over Chicago glowed orange until dawn. The Chicago Wrecking and Salvage Company had purchased the Court of Honor property for $100,000. They lost everything in a single evening. By October 1896, Scientific American reported that the salvage company had completed removal of the remaining structures. Of the more than 200 buildings erected for the fair, only 2 survive today. The Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry. The World's Congress Auxiliary Building, now the Art Institute of Chicago. Everything else was erased. The official explanation, the buildings were temporary. Staff construction wasn't meant to last. Fire was always a risk with the materials used. Accidents happened, insurance claims were filed, life moved on. But the pattern of destruction raises questions the official narrative doesn't address. Why did fires keep breaking out in structures that were under constant observation? Security patrols walked the grounds continuously. Watchmen were stationed throughout the complex. The fire department had been warned about the risks. Why did the blazes spread so efficiently through buildings supposedly protected by neutral zones? The architects had planned fire breaks. They knew the risks of concentrated wooden infrastructure. They designed accordingly. Those designs failed repeatedly. Why were the fires concentrated on the largest, most elaborate structures? The ones that would have been hardest to rebuild? The ones that contained the most evidence of how they were constructed? Contemporary reports noted speculation about arson, about deliberate destruction, about fires that seemed too convenient, too complete, too thorough to be entirely accidental. The speculation was dismissed. No one was ever charged. The investigation concluded without finding criminal cause. The Chicago Wrecking and Salvage Company purchased the remaining property and worked methodically through 1895 and 1896, dismantling everything that hadn't already burned. And here's what disturbs me most. The salvage operation was documented extensively. Photographs of buildings being torn down, records of materials being sold or disposed of, detailed accounts of the demolition process. We know exactly how they took it apart. But the construction records, the detailed plans showing how these structures were actually built, The engineering specifications that would allow us to understand how they achieved clear spans and load tolerances that challenged the limits of 1890s technology. Fragmentary, incomplete, lost. The demolition is preserved. The construction is erased. What if the world's Columbian Exposition wasn't a construction project? What if it was a discovery? Consider the evidence. A construction timeline that experts acknowledge was nearly impossible. Proportional anomalies throughout the structures that make no sense for human-scaled occupants. Labor requirements that exceeded the documented workforce by a factor of 3. Tools and equipment scaled for workers significantly larger than any human on the payroll. And then systematic destruction of nearly everything, followed by convenient loss of the technical records that would explain how it was accomplished. The pattern matches what we see in other investigations, structures that appear suddenly in the historical record, fully realized, with no documented evolution. Buildings scaled for occupants we're told didn't exist, and then coordinated erasure, fire, demolition, archive loss, until only fragments remain. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair occurred at a specific moment in history, the same decade when giant skeletons were being discovered across America and sent to institutions that later denied possessing them. Iowa, Ohio, California, Nevada. Bones measuring 7, 8, 9 feet in length, documented in newspaper accounts, photographed by excavators, shipped to museums, then lost. The same era when photographs showed individuals of extraordinary height in formal settings, standing in front of buildings with doorways that suddenly made sense when you saw who was meant to walk through them. Photographs that subsequently disappeared from public archives. The same period when Tartaria vanished from maps and the narrative of a global civilization was systematically erased from historical education. When encyclopedias that once documented an empire spanning from the Pacific to the Urals were quietly revised. When libraries purged references to a civilization that had appeared on every major map for centuries. What if the builders weren't the 14,000 workers on the payroll? What if they were the remnants of something older? A population physically capable of moving materials, operating machinery, and constructing at scales we consider impossible. What if the fair wasn't built to celebrate Columbus, but to provide a cover story? A plausible explanation for structures that already existed. Structures that needed to be shown to the public before they could be destroyed without arousing suspicion? Look at the White City. Really look. Not at what you've been told it represents, but at what the photographs actually show. Doorways too tall, staircases too steep. Proportions that make modern humans look like children in an adult world. Today, Jackson Park in Chicago is a pleasant green space. Joggers run along paved paths where colonnades once stretched to the horizon. Families picnic on grass that once supported the largest enclosed structure ever built. Children play where 27 million visitors once stood in awe. A few monuments remain. A Japanese garden, some relocated sculptures, plaques that mention what once stood here, but never explain why it vanished so completely. Of the White City that 27 million Americans witnessed in 1893, almost nothing survives. The greatest architectural achievement in American history, that's what they called it at the time. The marvel of the age, the White City that changed how Americans thought about urban planning, about public spaces, about what was possible when ambition met resources. A glimpse of the future built in 22 impossible months. And then, within 3 years, systematically erased. Why would you destroy something that magnificent? Why would you burn it, tear it down, scatter its materials, and lose its documentation? Unless you needed to ensure that no one would ever examine it too closely, that no one would measure the doorways and ask why they were built for giants, that no one would study the engineering and realize it exceeded what the documented labor force could have achieved. The 1893 World's Fair wasn't alone. Paris, 1889, London, 1851, St. Louis, 1904, San Francisco, 1915, Buffalo, 1901, Melbourne, 1880, Philadelphia, 1876. World's fairs across 2 continents, each featuring temporary structures of extraordinary grandeur, each followed by destruction or demolition of nearly everything constructed, each leaving behind only fragments, each erasing more evidence than it preserved, each following the same pattern: construction too fast, destruction too thorough, records too incomplete, temporary cities that appeared and vanished, architectural marvels built to last 6 months then erased from the earth, as if someone was deliberately hiding something, as if the fairs weren't celebrations of progress, but controlled demolitions of evidence. The question isn't whether they built the White City in 22 months. The question is whether they built it at all. Next week, we examine the Paris Exposition of 1889 and the pattern of evidence that connects every World's Fair from London to San Francisco. If this investigation made you question the official narrative, subscribe. There's more to uncover.